The first time Alden heard the wolf howl somewhere in the darkness beyond her dying fire, she did not flinch, because there were things in those Colorado mountains in the autumn of 1873 that frightened her far more than wolves, and all of them had 2 legs and the faces of men she had once trusted. She had been traveling for 11 days when the pains started in earnest. 11 days of leading a mule named Chester through switchbacks and loose shale slopes. 11 days of eating dried beans cold because building fires on high ridgelands in the dark was an invitation to be found. 11 days of talking to the 2 lives growing inside her belly as if they could already hear her and find comfort in the sound of her voice. She believed they could. She had believed a great many things that people in Durango would have called foolish. But Alden had learned that the opinions of Durango were not worth the breath it took to voice them. She made her camp that night in a shallow fold of rock on the eastern slope of a ridge she could not name, tucking herself and Chester into the shelter of an overhang that still held the warmth of the day's sun in its stone face. The grass was yellowing but thick enough for the mule to be content, and she had found a trickle of snowmelt running down the face of a mossy boulder not 50 yards back. She had filled every vessel she carried. She was, by the brutal arithmetic of survival, doing well enough. But the pains told a different story. She had expected them eventually. She was, by her careful counting, somewhere in her 8th month, though the physician in Durango, the one who had examined her once before she fled, had warned that twins often came early and came fast, and that a woman carrying 2 ought to be resting in a proper bed with a midwife close at hand. Emma had smiled at him then, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes, because she had known even as he spoke that resting in a proper bed was precisely what Marcus Aldrich would never allow her to do if she stayed. And she could not stay. She could not let those children be born in that house, registered under that man's name, handed over to a court that would call them his property, because her husband had money enough to make the law bend toward him like a flower toward a dishonest son. So she had run. She had taken Chester and a loaded rifle and 2 saddlebags of provisions and the small cedar box where she kept the $43 she had quietly saved over 14 months of marriage. And she had ridden north out of Durango before the October dawn had any color in it at all. The plan, such as it was, had a destination. A woman named Ruth Caldwell, her mother's cousin, who had settled near a small mining camp called Gideon's Fork outside of Gunnison. Ruth had written 3 letters over the past 2 years, each one containing between the lines of ordinary news the clear message that if Emma ever needed to come, the door would be open and the questions would be few. Emma had memorized the directions Ruth had included in her last letter. She had believed she could make it. She had not anticipated the early snow that buried the lower trail and pushed her high into country she did not know. She had not anticipated the 3 days of illness that had cost her time and energy she could not spare. She had not anticipated that her body, having carried its extraordinary burden for so long alone, would decide on this particular cold night that it was done waiting. The contraction that doubled her over was unlike anything she had felt before, a tightening so profound and encompassing that it took her breath clean away and left her gripping the saddle pack she was using as a pillow with both hands, her knuckles white in the firelight. When it passed, she lay very still and counted her breaths. Then she sat up and looked at the fire and looked at Chester and looked at the mountains shouldering up black against a sky absolutely crammed with stars, and she said aloud, to the twins and to herself, and to whatever God was listening above the timberline, "All right, we are going to do this, but you are going to give me until morning." The mountains did not argue, neither did the babies for another few hours. Gideon Kendrick had been riding for 2 days when he smelled the smoke. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered in the way of men who have spent the better part of a decade doing physical labor without much thought for anything except getting the work done, with dark hair that curled at his temples when it was damp, and a jaw that his mother had once said looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that made up the bluffs above the Arkansas River. He was not, by any serious reckoning, a complicated man. He knew cattle and horses and the particular moods of mountain weather, and how to read the land the way some men read newspapers. He knew that smoke on a cold October morning, faint and thin, and coming from a place too remote for any established camp, meant a fire that was either very small or very close to going out, and either possibility, in country like this, meant someone in trouble. He had been heading back toward Gideon's Fork after 3 weeks of working a cattle drive for a rancher named Patterson out of Montrose. He had $42 in his coat pocket, a good horse named Calamity under him, and no particular reason to be anywhere before the week's end. He turned Calamity toward the smoke without any real deliberation, the way a man turns toward something because turning away is simply not in his nature. He found the camp in the fold of rock beneath the overhang just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge and poured golden light across the shale. He nearly turned back when he saw the mule and realized the camp was occupied. A lone rider's camp in the high country was private by definition, and he had been raised to respect that. But then he heard the sound, a sound so human and so raw and so unmistakably that of a woman in extremity that every consideration except action left him completely. He swung down from Calamity before the horse had fully stopped moving, tied him to a scrub pine with hands that moved quickly but not frantically, and came around the overhang's edge with his hat in his hand, because it seemed absurdly like the right thing to do. She was propped against the rock face, her back straight despite everything, her hair dark and loose around her shoulders, her face sheened with sweat despite the cold. She had her rifle across her knees. Her eyes, when they found him, were green as creek water and absolutely ferocious with the effort of keeping herself controlled, and they held him in place as effectively as a hand pressed to his chest. "If you are with Marcus Aldrich," she said, her voice remarkably steady for a woman who was clearly in the grips of something enormous, "you should know that I have 6 rounds in this rifle and I am an excellent shot and I am not in a mood to be merciful." "I don't know anyone named Marcus Aldrich," Gideon said. "My name is Gideon Kendrick. I smelled your fire. I came to see if someone needed help." She studied him for a long moment. Another contraction moved through her and he watched her ride it without a sound, her jaw clamped shut, her eyes briefly losing their focus on him and turning inward to some place where she was fighting alone. When it passed, she exhaled slowly through her nose. "How do I know you are telling the truth?" she asked. "You don't," he said, "but I'd like to help if you'll let me. And if you won't, I'll stay out of your way and make sure your fire doesn't go out. I won't touch that rifle and I won't come any closer without your say-so." She looked at him again for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, "It's twins. I need help with twins." He had not expected that. But he had helped birth calves and foals, and once, memorably, a litter of hound dogs in a creek-bottom cabin during a flood. And he thought that the fundamental nature of bringing a life into the world was probably not so different regardless of species, and that the woman in front of him was clearly more capable than almost anyone he had ever met, and that what she needed from him was not heroics but steadiness. He put his hat back on his head and he moved closer and he said, "Tell me what you need." Her name was Emma Alden. He learned it an hour later, after the first twin arrived, a boy, small and red-faced and furious in the particular way of those who have been inconvenienced by the world before they were even fully in it. Emma held him against her chest with one arm while Gideon, who had managed not to panic despite the extraordinary nature of what he was doing, wrapped the child in the cleanest cloth she had in her pack, a piece of fine linen that she told him, between contractions, had been her mother's tablecloth. "Emma Alden," she said, when he asked her name, her voice soft now in the way of someone moving through exhaustion toward something quieter on the other side. "Gideon Kendrick," he said again in case she'd forgotten. "I hadn't forgotten," she said. "I was just deciding whether to trust you. And," she looked down at the boy in her arm, "you have good hands," she said. "Steady. I trust steady hands. The second twin was a girl, and she came into the world 20 minutes after her brother, smaller still but with a stronger cry that rang off the rock face and sent Chester the mule stamping one hoof in what might have been protest or might have been applause. Emma laughed when she heard that cry, a short, overwhelmed laugh that cracked in the middle and became something else for just a moment before she pulled it back under control. Gideon built up the fire until it was proper and warm. He heated water. He made a nest of his own bedroll and her blankets in the warmest corner of the overhang. He did everything she told him to do, and several things she hadn't thought to tell him because he noticed them himself, like the fact that she had not eaten since the previous evening, and that there was a crack in the overhang above them that was letting in a cold draft, which he stuffed with his bandana and a wad of dead grass. When she was settled and both babies were sleeping against her, one on each side, he sat back on his heels at a respectful distance and looked at the three of them, and he felt something move in his chest that he had no name for yet. It was not pity. Pity was a distant thing, a thing you felt for strangers. This was something more particular than that, something that had the specific weight of these three specific people and this specific cold morning, and the extraordinary fact of what had just happened in a fold of rock in the Colorado mountains. "You're going to need to rest a few days before you travel," he said. "I know that," she said. Her eyes were half closed but still alert. The rifle was no longer across her knees. He noticed that. "I'm not in a hurry to be anywhere," he said. "If you want, I can stay, keep the fire going, make sure Chester doesn't wander." She was quiet for a moment. The boy stirred and made a small sound, and she adjusted him slightly without looking away from the fire. "Why?" she asked. He thought about that honestly. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but it seems like the right thing to stay." Men who say they don't know exactly why they are doing something usually know precisely why, Emma said. They just don't want to say it. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and for a moment the tiredness left her face entirely, and she was simply herself, sharp and clear and complicated and not to be managed. "Maybe that's true," he said. She closed her eyes. "You can stay," she said, "but I need you to understand something, Gideon Kendrick. I am not in need of a rescuer. I need someone to keep the fire going and not make me feel small while he does it." "I understand that," he said, and he meant it. He kept the fire going for 4 days. The first day she slept more than she was awake, and he occupied himself with practical things. Gathering wood, tending Chester and Calamity, melting snow for water, cooking a thin but nourishing broth from the dried beef in her pack, supplemented with some wild onion he found growing in a sheltered spot below the ridge. He brought the broth to her when she woke, and he took the babies when she needed both hands free, and he did not hover, and he did not make commentary, and he did not treat her like someone who needed managing. The second day she was more awake than not, and she told him about Marcus Aldrich. She told it the way someone tells a difficult story when they are too tired to shape it carefully, letting it come out in pieces without particular order, trusting the listener to assemble the sense of it himself. He listened without interrupting. He fed the fire. The babies slept. Marcus Aldrich was a man of 38, a merchant in Durango with property and standing, and a genuine talent for appearing to those who did not know him well as a reasonable and even generous man. He had come courting Emma when she was 23, 2 years after her mother's death had left her the sole inhabitant of a homestead that was failing anyway. He had seemed kind then. She had been lonely and frightened, and not in a position to be as discerning as she might otherwise have been. She had married him in the spring of 1871, and she had understood her mistake within 6 months. He was not violent in the way that left marks that others could see. He was violent in the quieter, more devastating way of a man who used money and authority and the law as instruments to control everything in reach, who dismantled a person's confidence so gradually and so skillfully that by the time the dismantling was complete, the person could no longer remember what they had been before it started. He had isolated her from the few friends she had. He had controlled every dollar. He had made her feel, consistently and with great attention to detail, that she was fortunate he had chosen her, and that she ought not to test his patience by wanting things he had not decided she should want. When she discovered she was expecting, she had felt two things simultaneously: joy so fierce it frightened her, and a cold, absolute certainty that she would not raise these children in that house. It had taken her 8 months of careful, quiet preparation to make the escape real. When she finished, Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You made it." "I'm not there yet," she said. "No," he said, "but you made it this far, that's not nothing." She looked at him across the fire. "You do not seem like a man who says things just to be comforting." "I'm not," he said. "I say things I believe are true." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked down at the babies, both of them sleeping, their small faces impossibly perfect in the firelight. "I have not named them yet," she said. "I wanted to wait until they were here and I could look at them." "That seems sensible." "The boy," she said slowly, "I want to call him Daniel, after my father." "Daniel Alden," Gideon said, trying the sound of it. "That's a good name." "The girl," Emma said, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Clara." "Clara and Daniel," he said. "Clara and Daniel," she confirmed, and something in her face went soft in a way he suspected she did not often allow, something private and enormous that she did not try to share with him but also did not try to hide. He respected that. He turned back to the fire and let her have the moment for herself. The third day she sat up properly and insisted on helping with camp tasks that she was probably not entirely ready for, and he let her do the ones that would not hurt her and made no comment about the ones she chose not to attempt. They talked more that day. He told her about himself, about growing up in Kansas, about the ranch work that had taken him west at the age of 19, about the years of cattle drives and line camps, and the particular loneliness of a life lived mostly outdoors and mostly alone, which was a loneliness he had made his peace with without ever quite deciding he preferred it. He told her about Gideon's Fork, the small settlement outside of Gunnison where he had lately been working and where he kept a room above the livery such as it was. She sat up straighter when he mentioned Gideon's Fork. "That is where I am going," she said. He looked at her. "Is that so?" "My mother's cousin lives near there, Ruth Caldwell." "Do you know her?" He thought for a moment. "I know of a widow woman named Caldwell who has a homestead about 3 miles southeast of the camp. I don't know her personally." "That is her," Emma said, and the relief in her voice was so substantial it altered her whole posture, her shoulders dropping, her head coming up, as if a physical weight had been set down. "I have been traveling toward her for 11 days. You were maybe 2 days out when I found you," he said. "2 days," she repeated, and then she laughed, a brief, rueful sound. "2 days. You would have made it," he said, "even without me." She looked at him, something measuring and quiet in her expression. "I believe I would have," she said, "but I am glad I did not have to." On the 4th morning she said she was ready to travel, and though he thought perhaps one more day of rest would have been wise, he also understood that she was the only true authority on her own body and her own strength, and that she had demonstrated her judgment well enough. He packed camp with efficiency, reloaded Chester's packs with care for the babies, and constructed a kind of papoose sling from the linen tablecloth, tying it so that Clara could rest against Emma's chest while she rode. Daniel went into a padded box lashed to Chester's pack, a solution that Emma looked at with skepticism until Gideon demonstrated that it was snug and well cushioned, and that the mule's gait, which was smooth as old furniture, would not disturb the child. "You have done this before," Emma said. "No," he said, "but I paid attention to the problem." They set off down the mountain in the thin gold light of an October morning, Gideon in the lead reading the trail, Emma behind him on Chester with Clara against her chest, and Daniel sleeping in his box. Calamity brought up the rear, unhurried. The aspens had mostly gone to bear silver skeleton by now, but here and there a late-turning tree still held its gold, and the light caught them in a way that made the whole mountain look as if it were lit from within. He watched her from the corner of his eye as they rode. She sat straight despite everything. She kept her eyes moving, reading the terrain the way someone who has been frightened for a long time learns to read it, alert to everything. But there was something different in her face today, something he could not quite name, an easing that had not been there before. He thought it might be the direction of travel. She was moving toward something now, not just away. He thought about that for a while as they picked their way down through the timber. He thought about what it meant to spend 11 days running from something, and what it might feel like to finally be running toward. He thought about Ruth Caldwell's homestead 3 miles southeast of Gideon's Fork, and what happened after they got there, when he had delivered this woman and her 2 children safely, and his reason for being here was discharged. He thought about riding back to the livery and his room and the ordinary work of the place, and whether those things would feel the same as they had before he smelled that fire on the ridge. He thought they probably would not. They stopped at midday in a sheltered draw where a creek ran clean and cold over flat stones. Emma fed the babies and ate some of the dried biscuit and salt beef he had redistributed into her saddlebag that morning, and he drank from the creek and gave the animals water and did not comment on the fact that she had winced when she dismounted. She had done it quietly and managed it herself, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. "Can I ask you something?" she said, while they rested. "Yes," he said. "Why Gideon's Fork? Why there specifically?" He thought about it. "I came through 2 years ago on a drive. The country suited me. The pace of a small camp is easier on a man who prefers to know the people around him. I stayed." "You have no family there?" "No family anywhere in the way you mean. My mother died when I was 14, my father before that. I have a brother in Kansas who I write to at Christmas and who writes back at Easter. That's the sum of it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at Daniel, who was awake now and blinking at the sky with the solemn, baffled expression of a person confronting a world that is substantially larger than they had anticipated. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your mother." "It was a long time ago," he said. But he said it without dismissiveness, acknowledging the reality of it without being drawn under by it, and she seemed to understand that. She nodded once and turned back to the babies, and he appreciated that she did not press. They made another 4 hours of travel before the light began to go. He found them a campsite in the trees, lower down now, out of the wind, with deadfall enough for a good fire and a flat area of ground carpeted in dried pine needles that made for adequate sleeping. He set up her bedroll and his own on opposite sides of the fire at a distance that was respectful and unambiguous. She noticed this and said nothing about it, but he thought she noticed it. She sat by the fire after both babies were settled, and he handed her a cup of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had been making do with in her pack. He had real coffee beans in his kit and a small grinder, and this was, he had decided, the appropriate occasion to use them. She wrapped both hands around the cup and inhaled the steam with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated gratitude that it made something in him feel generous in a way he had no practice with. "I have not had real coffee in 3 weeks," she said. "Patterson's cook hoarded it," he said. "I brought a pound back just out of spite." She smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the taut, functional expression she had given him so far, but an actual unguarded smile that changed her whole face, made her look younger and warmer and considerably more dangerous to his composure. He looked at the fire. "Gideon," she said. "Yes. You have not once asked me why I ran. Most people would have asked by the second day." "You told me when you were ready," he said. "That seemed like the right order of things." She was quiet for a moment. "My husband will have sent men looking for me. He is a thorough man. I do not think they came this way because the early snow would have made the upper trail look impassable. But when I get to Ruth's, I will not be able to stay indefinitely without him eventually finding me." "What do you intend to do?" "Make a life," she said simply. "The West is large. The law in the territories is complicated. If I am far enough away and quiet enough about where I am, a man like Marcus Aldrich will eventually decide that the expense and embarrassment of pursuing me is greater than the satisfaction of recovering what he considers his property." She said the last 2 words with a precise, controlled contempt that left no ambiguity about her opinion of that framing. Men like him care primarily about their reputations. I know things about his business practices that he would prefer remained private. That is a kind of insurance. That is a clever plan, he said. It is the only one I have, she said. She drank her coffee. But it is a solid one. He looked at the fire. He thought about the things she had not said, which were numerous, and about the particular kind of courage it required to sit by a campfire in the mountains 10 days after giving birth to twins and talk about building a life with the calm confidence of someone who has looked at the odds squarely and decided they are manageable. He thought she was the most remarkable person he had encountered in 28 years of encountering people. He thought it would be a mistake to say so. "Good night, Gideon," she said, and gathered herself up and went to her bedroll. "Good night, Emma," he said, and stayed by the fire a while longer in the dark. They reached Ruth Caldwell's homestead in the early afternoon of the following day. It was a solid place, as homesteads went. A timber-framed house with a proper chimney, a barn in good repair, 2 milk cows in a paddock, a kitchen garden put to bed for the winter under a layer of straw. The woman who came out of the house when she heard the approach was 50-something, stout and silver-haired, and weathered in the way of someone who has spent years doing everything a farm requires with her own 2 hands. And when she saw Emma, she came off the porch and across the yard with the decisiveness of a woman who had been waiting for this arrival for a considerable time, and had decided that, when it came, she would not waste a moment of it on formality. "Emma," she said, and that one word contained everything. The hug she folded Emma into was careful of the baby on her chest, and still somehow fierce enough to communicate years of worry resolved in an instant. Emma let herself be held. Her eyes closed. Gideon hung back at the gate with the animals and gave the 2 women the privacy of the moment. When Ruth pulled back and looked at Emma's face, and then down at Clara, and then over at the box on Chester's pack where Daniel was making known his opinion of the recent journey, her expression cycled through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was partly tears and partly enormous practical determination. "2," she said. "2," Emma confirmed. Ruth looked at Gideon. "And this man, Gideon Kendrick," Emma said. "He found my camp in the mountains. He helped." She paused. "He was essential." Ruth looked at him with the thorough, unsentimental appraisal of a woman who had learned to judge people quickly because her circumstances had frequently required it. Then she said, "You'll stay for supper, Mr. Kendrick." "I don't want to impose," he said. "I did not phrase it as an invitation," Ruth said, and went back inside to start it. Supper was the best meal Gideon had eaten in a month, a beef stew with root vegetables and bread that had been baked that morning and butter from Ruth's own cows. They ate at a proper table, which was a luxury in itself, and the warmth of the house after weeks in the open air was so encompassing that he found himself struggling to keep his eyes fully open by the time the meal was done. Emma was across the table. She had changed into a dress from Ruth's wardrobe, something plain and dark blue that fit her approximately, and Ruth had helped her with her hair, which was pinned up now in a way that showed the line of her neck and the set of her shoulders. She looked, in the warmth and the light, like someone who was in the process of remembering who she was. The babies were sleeping in a cradle that Ruth had produced from her back room, explaining that she had kept it from her own children and grandchildren because she had believed it would be needed again eventually. Emma had looked at the cradle and then at her cousin and had said, "You knew I would come." "I hoped," Ruth said. "Knowing and hoping are different things, but the cradle stayed." Gideon watched Emma across the table and thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. He had been moving for most of his adult life, ranch to ranch, drive to drive, season to season. He had never had the specific experience of arriving at the place where someone had kept a cradle waiting for him. He was not sure he had ever had a place where anything was kept waiting. He thought about that on the ride back into Gideon's Fork. Ruth had pressed him to stay the night, but he had declined, feeling that the homestead was already full of things that needed space to settle, and that his presence, while well-intentioned, was not part of that settling. He had shaken Emma's hand at the door, which felt exactly wrong but was the only thing he could think to do, and she had looked at his hand in hers for a moment and then up at his face, and she had said, "Thank you, Gideon, for the fire, for everything." "Take care of yourself," he had said. "I always do," she had said. He had ridden away. He had ridden 3 miles and then sat on Calamity for a while in the gathering dark, listening to the horse breathe and watching the first stars come out, and he had felt the absence of her like a room he had been in and had now left, still warm from the fire but emptying. He went back the next morning. He told himself he was checking to see if everything had settled. He brought a ham he had bought from the general store in Gideon's Fork, and a bolt of blue calico that had caught his eye in the window, and which he told himself was a practical and impersonal gift for a household with 2 infants. Ruth opened the door and looked at the ham and the calico and looked at him, and her expression did not change at all, which was its own kind of commentary. She took the ham and the calico and said, "She's out back with the babies. The good chair is on the right." Emma was in the yard behind the house, sitting in the thin October sunlight, a baby on each knee, talking to them with the easy, unself-conscious concentration of someone who has already established a real relationship with 2 people who cannot yet talk back. She looked up when she heard his boots on the cold ground. For a moment neither of them said anything. Then she said, "Ruth told me you would probably come back." "Ruth seems to know a lot of things," he said. "She is irritatingly perceptive," Emma agreed. She looked at him steadily. "Why did you come back, Gideon?" He stood there in the yard with the October sun on his back and the mountains making their jagged line above the tree line, and he thought about all the ways he might answer that question carefully. And then he decided that he was 28 years old and had never once been a man who said things only out of caution, and that he was too old to start now. "Because I couldn't think of a good reason not to," he said. "And because the thought of going back to that room above the livery and not knowing how you were getting on seemed like a significant waste of my attention." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Clara, who was watching her brother with solemn, enormous eyes, and she said, "You should know that I am not looking for another man to make decisions for me." "I know that," he said. "And I have 2 children who are 3 days old and a legal husband I have not yet found a way to be rid of, and my circumstances are complicated by any reasonable measure." "I know that too," he said. "I have been alone in the way of someone who has learned to prefer it, not out of preference exactly but out of necessity, and I am not certain I know how to do otherwise." "Emma," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said. "I just came to see how you were getting on." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then something in her face shifted, not a surrender of any position but an acknowledgement of something she had been considering and had decided to name. "I am glad you came," she said. "Sit down, there is coffee." He sat. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. Within a week it had become a pattern so natural that Ruth stopped commenting on it, which was, Gideon understood, her way of giving it her approval. He would ride out in the mid-morning, stay through the afternoon, help with whatever the homestead needed. There was always something, a fence board, a stuck hinge, firewood to split and stack, eat dinner if invited, which was every other day and then every day, and ride back to town in the early dark. He and Emma talked constantly. It was the strangest thing about those early weeks, the way they talked, as if they had both been waiting for a specific kind of conversation partner, and had not understood what was missing until they found one. They talked about books, because Emma had brought 4 of them in her saddlebags, and he had read 2 of them before and 3 that she recommended afterward that Ruth had in her collection. They talked about the mountains and the weather and the cattle business and the history of the land. They talked about what Emma intended to do, which was to apply to Ruth's territory judge, a man named Harker who came through Gunnison 4 times a year, about the possibility of a divorce on the grounds of abandonment, since Marcus Aldrich could not prove otherwise given that Emma had gone north and not east and had covered her trail carefully. Divorce in 1873 Colorado territory was not simple, he acknowledged one afternoon. Judge Harker is a reasonable man, but he is still a man of the law, and the law leans certain ways. I know what the law is, Emma said, without bitterness. I also know what I have. Documentation. 3 letters I kept from Marcus's business correspondence that a man named Harker would find interesting reading if he is the kind of judge who values honesty in commerce. I also know that a woman who has been living separately and independently in the territory for 6 months with 2 children is in a different practical position than one who left last week. She looked at him. I am patient, Gideon. I have been patient for 2 years. I can be patient a while longer. He marveled at her. He did not say so. He had learned in those early weeks a great deal about how to be around Emma Alden, which was to say, directly, honestly, without condescension, and with the understanding that she did not need his admiration but that she would notice its presence or absence and draw her own conclusions about what it meant. He had stopped telling himself that he was just checking in, that these visits were practical. He knew what they were. The question was what to do with that knowledge when she had a husband she had not yet legally shed, and 2 3-week-old infants, and a life she was in the process of constructing with great care, and when he was a man with a room above a livery and no particular claim on anything. He kept coming. He brought things: soap from the general store, a second lamp for the bedroom where Emma and the babies slept, a small rocking horse he had carved himself from a piece of pine over several evenings in his room, though he told himself it was just something to do with his hands. Ruth had looked at the rocking horse and looked at him and looked at the rocking horse again, and had taken it inside without a word. In November, the real winter came down from the peaks, and with it, a new set of practical demands that changed the rhythm of his visits. The road between Gideon's Fork and the homestead became unreliable enough that he began sometimes staying an extra night in Ruth's barn, a compromise that Ruth proposed herself with perfect matter-of-factness, pointing out that there was a cot and a blanket and that Chester would benefit from the company. He slept in the barn those nights and lay awake listening to the snow on the roof, and thought about the particular shape his life had taken without his planning any part of it. He thought about Emma 3 walls away, feeding Clara in the dark, the small sounds of it that he sometimes heard faintly through the timber walls, the way she sang to them, low and tuneless and completely unself-conscious, songs he didn't know the words to but that settled into him like something he had been missing for a long time. One evening in late November, after supper, Ruth found a reason to be busy in the kitchen for a significantly extended period, and he and Emma sat by the fire alone with the baby sleeping, and it was the first time they had been properly alone since the mountains. The fire burned and the snow pressed against the windows, and she was sitting in the good chair reading, and he was doing nothing in particular, which was unusual for him, but he found that doing nothing in particular was very easy in this specific room. She looked up from her book. "Gideon," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think I am happier than I have been in a long time," he said, which is a strange thing to say given that I am sleeping in a barn. The corner of her mouth lifted. "I think about the mountains sometimes," she said. "About that first morning, you came around the overhang with your hat in your hand." "I didn't know what else to do with it," he said. "It was the right thing," she said. "I noticed it." She looked back at the fire. "I notice a great many things about you, Gideon." He kept very still in the way of a man who understands that the moment he is in requires him to let it unfold without interruption. "I notice that you have not once made me feel like I owe you anything," she said. "I notice that you speak to me the same way you spoke to me that first morning, like I'm a person with full authority over myself and my own decisions. I notice that you look at Daniel and Clara as if they are simply themselves, 2 particular people, not complications or burdens or inconveniences." "They are extraordinary," he said. 2 months old and already completely convinced of their own importance. Daniel especially. She laughed, and the laugh filled the room. "He is exactly like my father," she said, "stubborn and loud about it. He smiled. She smiled back, and they were looking at each other across the fire in a way that had no distance in it at all anymore. "Emma," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not ready to say anything yet, but I wanted you to know that I know." She held his gaze. "Is that enough for now?" "Yes," he said, and it was, because she had never yet said anything she did not mean, and he had learned to understand that with Emma Alden, knowing was not a small thing. It was the beginning of everything. The winter of 1873 into 1874 was hard in the way that Colorado winters were hard, which was to say, absolutely, without apology, without any of the civilized softening that the East tried to impose on the season with its roaring fireplaces and its social calendars. The cold was a physical thing with a specific quality that had no equivalent in other weather, a cold that found the gaps in every construction, and that turned familiar distances into genuine challenges. But Ruth's homestead was solid, as Ruth herself was solid, and the four of them 5, counting the babies, 6 counting Chester, 7 if you included Calamity, who was wintering in Ruth's barn and had developed a relationship with Chester that Ruth described as an understanding between two animals who both consider themselves the most important creature in any given room, made of it something that was not simply endurance, but something with the texture of actual living. Emma regained her full strength by December, which happened faster than he expected, though he supposed he should not have been surprised. She began to take on the full range of the homestead's winter work alongside Ruth, and she had a talent for it that was clear from the start, not the resigned competence of someone doing what must be done, but a genuine engagement with the practicalities of the land and the animals, and the season that reminded him of his own relationship with ranch work. She started teaching herself to ride properly in January, in the paddock behind the barn, on one of Ruth's horses, a patient bay mare named Josephine. He watched from the fence the first few mornings, ready to help if asked, and she did not ask, but she did eventually look over and say, "You can tell me if I am holding the reins wrong." And he had come off the fence and into the paddock, and they had spent 2 hours in the cold, their breath making clouds in the frozen air, and she had gone from tentative to competent in a way that was exhilarating to watch. "You are a natural," he told her. "I am a quick study," she corrected. "There is a difference. Natural suggests something that does not require effort. What I am doing requires considerable effort." He shook his head slowly. "You know, most people would just take the compliment." "Most people would be wrong to give it in that form," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. He taught her other things too, over the course of that winter, things that she had identified as needing and had asked him directly to teach her. How to track weather by the behavior of the animals and the color of the sky at certain hours. How to field strip and clean a rifle properly, which she had been doing approximately right but not perfectly. How to navigate by stars, which she had some knowledge of already but less than she wanted. Each of these lessons had a particular quality, standing close in the cold air with their heads together over a problem, her asking sharp questions, him answering them honestly and without elaboration unless elaboration was needed. He had never taught anyone anything before. He found that he was good at it, or at least that he was good at teaching her, which amounted to the same thing. Daniel and Clara grew with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of all healthy infants, becoming more themselves with each week. Clara had Emma's green eyes and a temperament that was quiet and watchful and alert, taking in the world from whoever was holding her with the expression of a scientist making careful notes. Daniel was louder and more gregarious, reaching for everything in reach, laughing with complete abandon at the smallest provocation, a quality that Ruth said was going to be either the making of him or the absolute end of the people who loved him, and said it with great warmth. Gideon held them both, often. It had begun practically, in the mountains, and continued out of comfort, and somewhere in the process it had become something he did not examine too closely, because examination would have required him to name things he was not yet certain he had the right to name. But he held Daniel and felt the weight of him, the warm, specific weight of this particular child, and he thought about what it meant to matter to someone who had not chosen you, but who looked at you with the simple trust of someone who has decided that the world is probably all right because you are in it. And he thought that it was the most extraordinary feeling he had ever had. He was thinking about all of this one February morning when a rider came to Ruth's gate. He saw the man from the barn, where he was breaking ice in the water trough, and something in the way the rider sat his horse made him set the axe down carefully and come out into the yard with his eyes clear, and his body easy in the way that was not casual but that was not alarmed either. It was a way of holding himself he had learned on drives, in camps, in the various places where strangers arrived, and it was important to read the situation before it read you. The rider was a thick-necked man in a dark coat, well-mounted, with the look of someone who was paid for his specific skills rather than for the general usefulness of a ranch hand. He looked at Gideon as he pulled up at the gate. "I'm looking for a woman named Emma Alden," he said, "wife of Marcus Aldrich of Durango. I have been retained to locate her." Gideon looked back at him with the absolute stillness of a man who has decided exactly what he is doing. "Don't know any woman by that name," he said. The rider looked around the yard. His eyes went to the house. "This is the property of a Ruth Caldwell. I'm told the woman might have family here." "Ruth Caldwell lives here alone," Gideon said. "Has done for years. You've had a long ride for nothing." The rider studied him. "You work this property." "I work the livery in Gideon's Fork," Gideon said. "I help out here some." The rider looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to the house again, and at that precise moment the door opened and Ruth came out onto the porch, entirely unhurried in her work apron, with flour on her hands as if she had been in the middle of baking, which she had not been. "Something I can help you with," Ruth said, her voice carrying the calm authority of a woman on her own property. "Looking for a woman," the rider said. "You found one," Ruth said pleasantly. "I am the only woman here, have been since my children grew and went. Is there anything else?" The rider looked between the two of them. He was a man who made his living finding things, which meant he was accustomed to lying faces, and Gideon could see him weighing what he saw against what he had been told. The yard was quiet. The snow was undisturbed except for a single set of boot tracks, his own. The house looked like a single woman's house looked. "Beg your pardon," the rider said at last, and backed his horse and turned and went the way he had come. Gideon waited until the sound of hooves was fully gone. Then he walked to the house. Emma was inside behind the door with both babies in her arms. She had heard all of it through the closed door. Her face was still and her arms were tight around Clara and Daniel and her eyes were absolutely steady on his. "He'll report back," Gideon said. "He may come again with someone else." "I know," she said. "That was faster than I expected. How long until you can approach Judge Harker?" "He comes through Gunnison in March," she said. 6 weeks. 6 weeks." He looked at her and she looked back at him, and the question was in the air without being spoken, and he answered it the same way. "Then we make sure nothing happens in those 6 weeks," he said. Ruth came in from the porch and closed the door and brushed the non-existent flour off her hands and said, "I've been thinking. The livery room is easier to watch from than an outlying homestead, and if there is a judge to see in March, it would be more useful for all concerned if we were in Gunnison when he comes." Emma looked at her. "You want to move into town. I want you to not be found in an outlying homestead before you have had the opportunity to speak to a judge," Ruth said with great precision. "The cows can winter in the barn. The house will keep. The livery man in Gideon's Fork has a proper room he can show us, and I have a friend in Gunnison with a house large enough." Gideon looked at Emma. Emma looked at the babies. Then she looked at him with those green eyes that had not once, in all the months since the mountains, given him anything less than the full truth of what she was thinking. "All right," she said. "Let's go to Gunnison." Ruth's friend in Gunnison was a woman named Harriet Marsh, a widow of 60, who had a house with 4 rooms and a wood stove that was the finest Gideon had ever been in the vicinity of, and who took one look at Emma and the babies and said, You will stay as long as you need, and I will not hear an argument about it." He stayed in a rooming house 2 streets over and came every morning and left every evening, and the weeks moved with the particular speed of time that is both tense with waiting and full of living. He had a conversation with Emma in the last week of February that he had been building toward for some time, and that he finally had because the 6 weeks were nearly up and Judge Harker was nearly in Gunnison, and he thought that some things ought to be said before circumstances changed them, one way or another. They were walking along the main street of Gunnison in the late afternoon, the babies in a borrowed perambulator that Harriet had produced from somewhere, the street quiet in the winter light. He had been talking about something inconsequential, and then he stopped talking and she turned to look at him. "Emma," he said. "Yes," she said, and her tone told him she had been expecting this particular conversation. "I want to tell you something, and I want to tell it simply, because I think you prefer simple to elaborate, and because I think it is simple." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I have been aware of it since approximately the time you told me you needed someone to keep the fire going without making you feel small. I have not said it because your circumstances were not the kind that invited it, and because I did not want to put weight on something that was already carrying a great deal, but I think you should know." She looked at him for a long moment in the February light. The babies were quiet in the perambulator. The street was empty. "I know," she said. "I have known for some time." And he said, and she said, "I love you back. That is also something I have been aware of for some time." He exhaled, not even having known he was holding his breath. "I want to be free first," she said. "Not because I need to be free before I can feel what I feel, but because I want to come to you as my own person, not as someone else's legal concern. Can you understand that?" "Yes," he said. "Then let us wait a few more weeks," she said, "and then let us see." He reached over and took her hand. She let him. They walked along the winter street of Gunnison in 1874 with the mountains above the town and the cold, clean air and the babies between them in the perambulator. And he felt something so large and quiet settle into him that he had no word for it except, finally, home. Judge Harker came to Gunnison on the 14th of March, a spare, thoughtful man who wore spectacles and had the considered manner of someone who believed in taking his time with things because most things deserved it. Emma met with him in the courthouse, a recently built structure of timber and stone that had the provisional quality of all government buildings in the territories. Gideon waited outside on a bench with Daniel on his knee and Clara in his arms, both of them decidedly awake and opinionated about it. She was inside for 2 hours. He sat on the bench and waited and talked to the babies, telling them an improvised story about a man named Chester who was actually a mule but considered himself a philosopher, a story that Daniel received with great enthusiasm, and Clara received with the studied attention of someone taking notes on the genre for future reference. When Emma came out, she came out slowly, and for a moment her face was unreadable. Then she sat down beside him on the bench, and she took Clara from his arms and held her daughter, and she said, "He will hear the case." He breathed. "It will take time," she said. 3 months, perhaps 4. He will notify Marcus Aldrich formally. Marcus will have the opportunity to contest. The letters I brought will be admitted as evidence of character." She paused. "He told me that in his experience, men with the kind of business practices visible in those letters tend to prefer resolution to public scrutiny. Meaning he thinks Marcus will not fight it. Meaning he thinks Marcus will weigh his reputation against his wife and make the calculation that most men of his kind make," Emma said, with the flat, level tone of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by that particular calculation. "He may be right. And if he fights it, then it takes longer," she said. "But it still ends." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those green eyes, clear as mountain water. "It ends," she said again firmly, as if making it a fact by the saying of it. He reached over and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, the first time he had touched her face, a small gesture and a significant one. She went very still for a moment. Then she leaned into his hand just slightly, just the smallest yielding, and it was the most trust he had ever been given. The waiting months were not empty. They were full, in the way that life with Emma Alden was inevitably full. She found work in Gunnison, quickly and on her own terms, giving reading and writing lessons to the children of the mining camp families, many of whom had come west without access to proper schooling. She had a gift for teaching that he recognized immediately as coming from the same source as everything else she did. She was fully present with whoever she was teaching. She paid attention to how they learned as much as to what they were learning. She was patient without being condescending and demanding without being frightening. The families paid in coin and sometimes in goods, and by April she had enough to contribute to Harriet's household expenses and to begin setting aside the beginning of what she called, quietly and without drama, our fund. He had noticed the word "our." He had not said anything about it. He had felt it the way you feel sunlight. He found steadier work himself, at a livery in Gunnison proper, where the owner was looking for someone reliable with horses and the good judgment to handle the variety of characters that passed through a busy livery in a growing mountain town. He was good at the work and he enjoyed it, and it paid better than the room above the livery in Gideon's Fork had ever warranted. He stopped thinking of himself as passing through. The spring came and the aspen leaves returned, and Daniel learned to sit up on his own, which he did with great satisfaction, and Clara learned to laugh, which she did selectively, and with the air of someone choosing to honor you with something precious. Emma had a letter from Judge Harker in April confirming that Marcus Aldrich had been notified and had been given 60 days to respond. She read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in the cedar box with the $43, which had been added to significantly but which she had kept as the box anyway, because some things earn their place through what they represent. They had their first real argument in May about money, specifically about a piece of land east of Gunnison that he had found and thought they should consider seriously. He had brought it up in the way of someone sharing an idea, and she had heard it in the way of someone who was accustomed to men making plans about property that affected her without consulting her, and for 20 minutes they talked past each other in the particular way of two people who are arguing about something other than what they appear to be arguing about. Then Emma stopped mid-sentence and was quiet for a moment and said, "I think I am hearing something that is not what you said." "And I think I said something that did not convey what I meant," he said. They started again. He explained. He had seen the land, he thought it was good, he was asking what she thought. She explained. She had spent 2 years having things decided without her input, and it had left a reflex she was still unlearning. He told her that nothing about this or any other thing that affected them both would be decided without her full participation. She told him that she believed him and that the reflex was hers to manage, and she was sorry it had come out at him. "Don't be sorry," he said. "I'd rather know." She looked at him steadily. "You say that." "I mean it," he said. "Every time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the land." He told her about the land. 2 weeks later they rode out together to look at it, the babies with Ruth, Harriet having come to Gunnison for the season as she did every spring. The land was 60 acres of good grass and timber on the eastern slope of a hill with a creek running along its southern edge, and a view of the mountains that would have made a painting. There was an existing structure, not much more than a shell, but the timber was sound, and the foundation was stone. Emma walked the creek line and walked the hill and stood at the edge of the timber looking at the view for a long time. He waited. "What do you see?" she asked, not testing him, genuinely asking. "A house there," he said, indicating the existing structure. "A barn here. The creek runs year-round, so there's water for animals, and a garden. The slope faces southeast, so there's light most of the day. It's 15 minutes from town, which is close enough to matter and far enough to breathe." She turned and looked at him. "I see the same things," she said. "I also see a school." He tilted his head. "There are 30 children in Gunnison and its surrounds who have no proper schoolhouse," she said. "I have been teaching them in Harriet's front room, which is generous of Harriet but limiting for everyone. A piece of land this size could accommodate a proper building. She looked at him carefully. "If you do not object." "Object," he said. "Emma, a school on our land is not a thing I would object to." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the land, and he could see the shape of it forming in her, the specific and detailed shape of a life she was choosing, deliberately, with all the information and all the authority that was hers. "Let's buy it," she said. They bought it in June, with combined funds and a fair price from the owner, who was heading to California and had been trying to move the property for 8 months. The letter from Judge Harker came in July. Marcus Aldrich had responded to the notification through a Durango attorney with a single-page document asserting his intent to contest. Emma read it alone first, then handed it to Gideon. He read it and waited for her to tell him what she thought. "He is bluffing," she said. "This is a tactic. If he intended to genuinely contest, he would have sent an attorney in person. A paper response from Durango is a man testing whether I can be frightened back into place. And can you?" She gave him a look of such perfect, specific patience that he almost apologized for asking. "The answer to that," he said, "was obvious." "Write the judge back," she said. "Tell him we are ready to proceed." He wrote the letter. She dictated most of it. Judge Harker set a formal hearing for August. The August hearing was in the Gunnison courthouse and lasted most of a morning. Marcus Aldrich did not appear himself, which the judge noted with significant pointedness. His Durango attorney appeared and made arguments that Emma had anticipated so precisely that Gideon, watching from the gallery, suspected she had spent the 2 months since the July letter preparing for each one individually. She sat at the plaintiff's table composed and clear, and answered every question put to her with the kind of specific, documented accuracy that leaves very little room for doubt. The letters she had brought from Durango were admitted and read, and the judge's expression as he read them told its own story. He ruled that afternoon. Abandonment was established. The interests of the children were primary. The marriage was dissolved. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table for a moment after the ruling, very still, and Gideon could see her shoulders from the gallery, and he could see the precise moment when something that had been held rigid for years let go, a barely visible shift, a settling, like a frame that has been under pressure and is finally level. Then she turned around and looked up at him in the gallery, and her green eyes were bright and her face had the particular quality of someone arriving somewhere they have been walking toward for a very long time. He met her at the courthouse door. She came out into the August sunlight and he was there, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and she said, "That's done." "Yes," he said. "All of it," she said. "That entire chapter, it's finished." "Yes," he said. She reached out and took his hand, and they stood there for a moment in the Gunnison sunlight, this woman and this man who had found each other in the mountains at the beginning of a long, cold season, and who had, without either of them quite deciding to, built something in the months since that was more than either of them had planned and exactly what both of them needed. "Gideon," she said. "Yes. I would like to be married to you," she said, "when it seems right. When we have had enough time for me to simply be myself in a life that is mine." She paused. "But I wanted you to know that is what I want." He looked at her. He thought about that first morning on the ridge, the woman with the rifle across her knees and the fire going out, and 2 lives arriving into the cold air of an October mountain. He thought about everything that had come between that morning and this one. He thought about the land east of town, and the house they had started planning, and the schoolhouse she was going to build, and the children they had already, and the life that was accumulating around them, quietly and with great solidity, like the stone foundations that endure. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here." She squeezed his hand, and they walked back toward Harriet's house together in the summer light, and the mountains stood above the town the way they always did, patient and enormous and absolutely indifferent to the small human dramas that played out at their feet, which somehow made those dramas feel more real, and not less. He proposed properly in September in the evening on the land east of town, standing near the creek with the aspens turning gold again, and the mountains going rose-colored in the last light. He had thought about elaborate words and decided against them because Emma valued honesty over ornamentation, and what was honest was this: he loved her. He wanted to build the house and the school and the life. He wanted to be Daniel and Clara's father in every way that word could mean. He wanted to sit across fires from her for the rest of his life and talk about books and land and weather and the things that people who are genuinely known to each other talk about with the ease of long practice. He said most of this, standing by the creek, and she listened to all of it without interrupting, which she did for very few things. When he was finished, she said, "Yes, just yes," complete and unambiguous and without qualification, and from Emma Alden that was everything. They were married in October, 1 year and a few days after he had found her camp in the mountains. The ceremony was in Gunnison, in the small stone church, and it was brief because Emma had made clear that she had no interest in elaborate ceremony and considerable interest in an efficient marriage license followed by a good dinner. Ruth was there, and Harriet, and several of the families whose children Emma taught, and the livery owner, and a few men from the cattle work who had ridden over because Gideon Kendrick was the kind of man who had people who would ride over, even if he did not always know it about himself. Emma wore a dress of deep green that she and Ruth had made from cloth bought in Gunnison, and when she came down the church aisle with Daniel in her arms and Clara being carried by Ruth, and her eyes found him at the front of the church, he forgot for a moment how to stand normally because she was so entirely herself, so entirely the person he had been discovering for a year, looking at him with those green eyes that had never once been anything but completely honest. The minister said the words. They said their own. He had memorized his because some things deserved to be said without paper in hand. She had written hers and read them from a small card, which was entirely correct because Emma Alden trusted the written word and believed in precision, and he loved her for both things absolutely. Afterward there was dinner in Harriet's house, which had been opened wide for the purpose, and Ruth had baked for 3 days, and Harriet's neighbor had contributed a ham, and there was good food and better company. And the babies were passed from arm to arm, and Daniel laughed at the ceiling with complete abandon, and Clara regarded the assembled company with her habitual scientific attention, and found it apparently satisfactory. He stood at some point in the evening with a glass of good whiskey and watched Emma laughing with Ruth across the room, her head thrown back, a full and unguarded laugh that he had been collecting all year the way some men collect coins or stories, and he thought that this was the specific shape of the rest of his life, and that the specific shape of the rest of his life was exactly right. They spent the winter building. He and 2 men from Gunnison, who he had hired for the work, raised the walls of the house through October and November, and got the roof on before the serious cold descended. It was a proper house, 4 rooms, with a kitchen that Emma had drawn the plans for herself with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about how work moves through a space, with good windows to the south for light, with a bedroom large enough for them, and a smaller room for the babies that could, with time and walls, become 2 rooms for 2 children who would eventually require their own spaces. Emma taught through the winter from Harriet's front room while the house was being finished, and she and Gideon talked in the evenings at Harriet's table about the schoolhouse plans, which became more specific with each passing week. She wanted it to be proper. Not a shed, not a room in someone's existing building. A real schoolhouse with real desks and a real teacher, which was to say herself, and a slate board and a good lamp for the winter afternoons when the light went early. He said they could build it in the spring, alongside the house, from the timber on the eastern slope of the property that had been saying for some time that it was ready to be used for something. "You hear timber talking to you," she said. "I hear the land," he said. "When you're out here enough, you start to understand what it's saying." She gave him a look that was both skeptical and fond, which was a combination she deployed often and which he had decided was one of the finest things about her. They moved into the house in December, a move that was accomplished in a single day, and that was marked by Gideon carrying Emma across the threshold, because it was tradition, which she allowed with a slight roll of her eyes that entirely failed to conceal her pleasure, and by Daniel immediately pulling himself to standing against the kitchen table and surveying his new domain with the expression of a general taking a city, and by Clara sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor and looking at the ceiling and then at the walls and then at her mother with an expression that communicated clear and measured approval. Ruth stayed through Christmas and then returned to her homestead in January, which Emma had expected and accepted without making it smaller than it was. The parting was the full weight of what Ruth had done, what she had been across all the years of letters and the open door and the cradle waiting. Emma held her at the gate for a long moment, and Ruth said, "Your mother would be so glad." And Emma pressed her eyes shut and nodded, and then stepped back and watched her cousin drive away down the winter road and then turn back to the house and the life inside it. Gideon was in the doorway. She walked toward him across the yard, and he held the door open, and she went inside, and he followed her, and that was all, and it was everything. The schoolhouse went up in April 1875, as promised, from timber that had indeed seemed to be waiting for it. Emma opened it in May with 14 students ranging in age from 5 to 13, and a supply of chalk and a set of primers that she had ordered from a Denver bookseller over the winter. The opening day was a thing of simple, significant beauty. Children arriving on foot and by horse through the morning sun. Parents watching from the fence with the particular quiet pride of people who want something for their children that they did not themselves have. Emma at the door of the schoolhouse she had built on land that was hers, speaking to each child by name because she had already learned them all. He watched from the fence with Daniel on his shoulders. Clara was beside him on a blanket on the grass, which she was investigating with her customary thoroughness. He watched Emma, and he thought about everything she had carried to get here, the distance measured not in miles but in everything that miles represent, decision and endurance, and the specific, unspectacular courage of keeping going when the alternative is easier. He thought he was the luckiest man in Colorado, which was not, he acknowledged privately, a category typically associated with a man who had found a woman in labor in a mountain camp. But the West had never been particularly interested in conventional categories, and he had long since decided that conventional categories were the least interesting thing about any situation. By the autumn of 1875, it was clear that their family was growing again. Emma told him on a morning in October, the aspens gold again beyond the kitchen window, Daniel and Clara playing on the floor with the wooden blocks he had carved over the previous winter, the house full of the specific warmth of a home that has been inhabited with care. She told him directly, which was how she told him everything, and she watched his face while she did. Whatever he was feeling arrived in his face with complete honesty. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her carefully, the way you hold someone who contains something precious, and she put her arms around him and pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a moment in the October kitchen while Daniel knocked down a tower of blocks and laughed at the ceiling, and Clara regarded the ruins of the tower with quiet, assessing interest. "Are you glad?" she asked into his shoulder. "Yes," he said, simply and completely. "Are you?" She lifted her face and looked at him, those green eyes clear as mountain water. "Yes," she said, "I am very glad." The pregnancy was different from the first, steadier, slower, without the fear that had shadowed every week of carrying the twins. She had proper rest and good food, and a house with a real bed and a husband who checked on her without hovering, and who listened when she told him how she was feeling, and who took over the outdoor work with quiet efficiency, and who, she told Ruth in a letter, was exactly the kind of person she would have designed if she had been given the specifications and the patience to wait. Ruth wrote back, "I kept the cradle for a reason. You can borrow it again." She did borrow it again. The baby came in April 1876, in the bedroom of the house east of Gunnison, with a midwife named Mrs. Thayer who had come recommended by Harriet, and who was calm and experienced, and nothing like the frantic absence of help in those mountain hours 3 years before. Emma worked through it with the same determination and quiet ferocity that she brought to everything, and Gideon was there the whole time, exactly where she needed him to be, doing exactly what was required without needing to be directed twice. A boy. He arrived in the April light and made himself known immediately, loudly and with conviction, and Emma laughed even before she had fully caught her breath, the laugh of someone receiving something extraordinary and knowing it exactly. "He sounds like Daniel," Gideon said. "God help us both," Emma said, and held out her arms. They named him James. James Kendrick, who arrived in the spring of 1876 and was received into a household that had been built, brick by brick, from the particular combination of two people who had found each other in the mountains and decided, without either of them exactly planning it, that they were not done. The years that followed were good years. They were not without difficulty, because no years without difficulty exist, but the difficulties were of the kind that belonging to a place and a family and a life provides the resources to meet. The cattle work and the livery work and the growing needs of the school and the land kept them busy in the way of people who have chosen their work well, which is to say, fully and without much complaint. Emma's school grew. By 1877, she had 22 students and had written 3 letters to the Territorial Education Office in Denver making a case for a formal teaching appointment that would come with a modest territorial salary. And on the 3rd letter they had complied, because the evidence she provided was comprehensive, and because Emma Alden Kendrick was not the kind of person who allowed a worthy argument to be ignored through persistence alone, but whose arguments had the additionally useful quality of being correct. Daniel and Clara started school in the fall of 1877, a circumstance that had a quality of completed circle about it that Emma mentioned one evening by the fire after the children were all in bed. "My children learning to read in my school on my land," she said. She did not expand on it. She did not need to. "On our land," he said. She looked at him. The firelight did what firelight does to green eyes, made them extraordinary, made them say things that words would have been inadequate for. She smiled. "On our land," she said. Ruth came for a long visit every summer, and Harriet came with her half the time, and the house was loud in the way of a house that has more love in it than it was built to hold, and which has expanded, as such houses do, to accommodate. Chester the mule lived to a considerable age and was retired to the paddock in the fullness of time, where he existed with the philosophical dignity of an animal who considers his debts paid and his position secured. Calamity, Gideon's horse, who was already aging when they met, died in the spring of 1876, and it was Clara who put her small, serious hand in her father's hand and said, in the grave and precise way that was entirely her own, "He was a very good horse." Gideon had agreed. He had said it was one of the truest things anyone had ever said about anything. One evening in the summer of 1878, Gideon and Emma sat on the porch of the house east of Gunnison, while the light went long and gold over the mountains, and the children's voices came from inside the house, Daniel describing something to James with great urgency, Clara reading aloud to herself in the particular way she had that suggested she was the audience she most wanted to reach. The school sat quiet in the field below them, its door shut, its windows dark, its use complete for the day and ready for tomorrow. He looked at the mountains. She looked at the mountains. They had been sitting in comfortable silence for several minutes, which was one of the specific and underrated gifts of people who have found their rhythm together, the ability to be in the same space without filling it. "Do you remember the first morning?" she said. He did not need to ask which morning. "Yes. You came around the overhang with your hat in your hand," she said. "I nearly shot you." "I know," he said. "I have never been more grateful for your good judgment in not doing so." She laughed. It was the full laugh, the unguarded one, the one that changed her whole face. He had been collecting it for 5 years, and he was still collecting it, and he suspected he would be collecting it for the rest of his life. "I knew," she said, "even then, something about the way you said you would stay and keep the fire going, something about the way you meant it." "I did mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "That was how I knew." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had in the winter street of Gunnison when she first told him she knew what they were. She held his hand in both of hers. The mountains turned from gold to rose to the deep blue of approaching dark. Inside the house, Daniel's voice rose and fell. Clara's reading paused and resumed. James, who was 2, had been put to bed before the fire was lit and was presumably asleep, though with James one could never be entirely certain. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked him in Ruth's house in that first winter by the fire in the cold. He gave her the same honesty he had given her then, the kind that has no performance in it. "Yes," he said, "I am happy." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The first stars came out above the mountains, sharp and particular in the high Colorado sky, the same stars he had looked at from the ridge that night when he had smelled the smoke from a dying fire and turned his horse toward it, because turning away was simply not in his nature. He was glad, every day of his life, that it was not. Inside the house, Daniel's voice settled into storytelling cadence, and Clara's reading became quiet, and James slept on through the evening without incident, and the porch held 2 people who had built something together from nothing except the particular and extraordinary fact that one of them had kept a fire going, and the other had let him. The mountains stood above the valley as they had always stood, patient and enormous, indifferent to small human dramas in the way of things that have watched centuries pass, except that this drama was not small, and the mountains, if they had paid any attention at all, would have had to admit it. This was the house. This was the land. This was the school and the children and the life built from the ruins of a harder one. The life that Emma Alden had begun to build in the mountains alone, carrying everything she had and everything she loved, moving towards something she did not yet know the shape of, before a cowboy rode toward the smoke of her dying fire and sat down and kept it burning and never left.